Sounds like a great deal for the EU. I think we have to take a look at seriously whether or not the UK is allowed to trade.
Given that TLDR News is best known for covering Brexit, and we've also recently created a US channel, it seemed only logical to bring those things together and release this video. This video is going to be about how Brexit will impact the US, and this is a topic we originally discussed on the UK channel a few months back. We thought it was worth revising and revisiting this topic on our new US channel. If this is your first time watching this channel, make sure to subscribe to be updated every time we release a new video. Before we get into that though, I want to take a second to let you know that we have some new US merch designs. On top of the stuff we sell for TLDR News UK, we also have some US specific things, like our American take on the countries with shoes designs, states with shoes. You can check these out along with our other merch over on our store. There's a link to that in the description. So far, Brexit hasn't really affected the US all that much. Most of the impact has come in the form of exchange rate movement, as political uncertainty from Britain and Europe has more generally triggered a fall in both the pound and the euro. Before the Leave result, the pound was trading at about $1.50, as investors predicted a Remain victory. In the next 24 hours, the pound fell to a low of $1.32 against the dollar and $1.20 against the euro. In October 2016, as Theresa May declared that she'd be triggering Article 50, the pound fell even further, to an intraday low of $1.18 for the first time in 30 years, and €1.11 in a 3-year low against the euro. Since then, the pound has tended to hover between 127 and 130 against the US dollar, and 112 and 114 against the euro. This might sound like great news for the US. Americans can finally ditch their trips to Hawaii and go on the cheap holidays to Blackpool they've always dreamed of, or, more likely, bought up cheap UK stocks. In reality though, it hasn't been all good for Americans. A strong dollar means that US manufacturing and exports are less competitive. There'd been some hope that Brexit would give New York a competitive advantage over the City of London, but so far that's not really materialised. Although it might if the UK doesn't get the passporting right it needs to trade financial services in Europe. Anyway, enough economics, I'm even boring myself here. Brexit has always been pitched as a way to reignite the special relationship between the UK and US, to go back to the good old days of Bush and Blair. However, while some Brexiteers have been pretty keen on such an idea, it hasn't been fully reciprocated by the US. Obama told the UK that they'd be at the back of the queue if the UK came to the US asking for a trade deal.
Maybe some point down the line there might be a UK-US trade agreement, but it's not going to happen anytime soon because our focus is in negotiating with a big bloc, the European Union, to get a trade agreement done. And UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
And Trump hasn't been much better. While he said that Brexit is a good thing, Trump has also criticised May's handling of Brexit and suggested that Boris Johnson would make a great Prime Minister. In good news for Trump, Johnson is almost certainly about to become Prime Minister, which means his Brexit plan will be implemented in place of May's. If you're interested in that, there's a whole video on the topic on our UK channel. There's a link to that down below. Trump has also suggested that if the UK goes with a soft Brexit and doesn't fully leave the customs union or the EU's regulatory framework, it will probably kill the deal.
Sounds like a great deal for the EU, and I think we have to do this. I think we have to take a look at seriously whether or not the UK is allowed to trade. Right now, as the deal stands, they may not be able to trade with the US. And I don't think they want that at all. That would be a very big negative for the deal.
As is often the way with Trump, it's almost impossible to tell what he actually thinks. Nonetheless, some politicians are optimistic about the deal. Nigel Farage claims it could be done in just 48 hours. Though maybe you should take that one with a pinch of salt. But let's talk about this much anticipated UK-US trade deal. Obviously we can't predict the future, so we don't know exactly what sort of commitments the UK will have made with the EU by the time the UK gets round to leaving, and what sort of limits this places on other trade deals the UK is allowed to create. But let's look at some of the proposals that have been made. The Initiative for Free Trade, a think tank founded by MEP Daniel Hannan, and the CATO Institute, a libertarian American think tank, have proposed outlines for a US-UK free trade deal. They advocated for a comprehensive negative list free trade market deal, in which all sectors, unless explicitly listed, are included in the deal. The model deal includes freedom of movement between the UK and US, prohibitions on non-tariff barriers such as food standards, zero tariffs on goods, zero restrictions on cross-border data flow, zero restrictions on cross-border investment, and no investor-state dispute settlement, one of the main points of controversy in TTIP. It also suggested that health services would benefit from foreign competition, suggesting that US health companies should have access to NHS contracts, although admitting that this was a controversial move. So let's take a look at this deal and if it could work. For this to happen, the UK would have to diverge massively from EU standards on just about everything. That would mean a hard border somewhere, either in Ireland or in the Irish Sea. The whole Irish border issue is a huge one, so let's just assume that happened. And let's think about how popular this type of deregulation would be. Part of deregulating food standards is to allow US agricultural firms to sell products such as chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef, which are both currently prohibited in the UK due to EU regulation. This isn't a particularly popular idea on either side of the Brexit divide. And then there's free movement, which, according to the polls, is one of the main reasons why people voted to leave the EU. Again, that looks like a tough sell for any government. And finally, there's the possibility of American health giants handling NHS contracts. Passing over a national institution, which provokes an almost universal sense of patriotism to American corporations, could be political suicide for any politician who tried it. Now, in anticipation of a tirade of comments calling TLDR a load of pessimistic Ramonas who don't understand economics, I should stress that we're not saying that free market libertarianism or a trade deal based on those principles is a good or bad thing. Just that in this current political climate, a deal like this looks politically impossible. And you might be saying, who cares about Daniel Hannan? He doesn't speak for the US. And you'd be completely right. But we do have some information on what the US wants. Every year, the US publishes something called the National Trade Estimate Report, which describes their positions on aspects of international trades and what they expect from trade deals. So let's look at the National Trade Estimate Report for 2018. Pretty predictably, it takes issues with the EU sanitary regulations. This means that if the UK wants to do a trade deal with the US, they're probably going to have to lower their regulations to US levels. Now you might be asking why everyone's so stressed out about chlorinated chicken. Surely if you were that bothered, you could just buy English chicken or non-chlorinated American chicken. But the National Trade Estimate Report also takes issue with country of origin labelling. So you might not end up knowing where your chicken is coming from. This is important for another reason. The UK has already signed up to the EU's regulatory framework called Geographical Indications, which basically means that for someone to sell sparkling wine or champagne, it has to be produced within the region. It's not enough to use the same grapes and the same process in America. It has to be produced in the right place. And it's not just for champagne. The EU does it for other foods like Roquefort cheese and Parma ham. The US thinks this is stupid, as it gives a competitive advantage to those local industries, which means that the US would like the UK to give up on this, but they've already signed up to it now. Another reason why a trade deal might end up being a little more difficult. However, this is a relatively small barrier. Surely fake US champagne producers won't whinge enough to stop an international trade deal. Well, EU regulations are no small barrier, but they don't make things impossible. There are other, more fundamental factors which make a trade deal with the US more difficult. Firstly, Trump doesn't speak everyone else's economic language. He's not a free trade advocate, and instead is mainly concerned with deficits. As we've seen, he clearly doesn't mind tariffs, and knows the political value of protecting traditional American industries, like manufacturing or agriculture, which is why EU food regulations might be more of a barrier than you'd expect. But even more fundamentally, the UK wants a trade deal far more than the US does. I know this sounds like a typical Remainer line, but let's look at some of the facts. Every year, the World Bank produces a report of each country's trade as a percentage of GDP. This is supposed to be a metric of how reliant each country is on global trade. The latest data we have is from 2016, but it's relatively consistent. In 2016, the UK's trade as a percentage of GDP was 59%, while the US's was only 27%. The UK relies on exports for 30% of GDP, while the US relies on exports for only 12%. The US is a far larger economy, with a larger consumer market, which means that their economy is more than twice the size of the UK's. So while a trade deal could happen, the UK doesn't look like it's in a particularly strong negotiating position. This sound very familiar? Ringing some bells? Making trade deals post-Brexit might not be as easy as some Brexiteers want you to think, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. We'll continue to follow the proposed UK-US trade deal and any other ways that Brexit affects the US. If you're interested in more US news, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when we post videos. You can also find TLDR News US across other social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. Also, if you want to get your name credited at the end of the video like these people, make sure to sign up to our Patreon. It applies across both our UK and US channel, so if you get your name in one place, you get it in both.